The coat smelled of horse and cold leather, and it was 3 sizes too large, and it was the only thing in the world that could carry her past the footman at the north stair without a single question asked. Eliza Marsh pulled the collar high against her jaw and kept her head down and her stride long. The way she had watched the grooms cross the yard 100 times, and she walked straight through the servants' passage toward the door. No one was permitted to open. Rain ticked at the high windows of Ravensmoor. Somewhere behind her a clock struck 11. She had 1 candle unlit in her fist, and a key that was not hers, and a question that had kept her awake for 6 nights running. What she did not yet know was that the wing she meant to enter had been sealed for a reason. Its master had never once spoken aloud. If you have ever wanted to know a thing so badly that you were willing to become someone else to learn it, then stay a while. You will understand her before the night is done. She had come to Ravensmoor in September, as a governess, hired by letter, sight unseen, to teach a child she had been told almost nothing about. The house sat gray and enormous on the edge of the moor, its east front blind with shuttered rooms, its gardens gone long and soft at the edges the way gardens go when no one with the heart to prune them remains. On her first morning, the housekeeper, a spare woman named Mrs. Dean, had walked her through the parts of the house she was allowed and named, without pausing, the parts she was not. The library she might use, the morning room she might use, the north wing she would not enter, would not approach, would not ask about Mrs. Dean had said it the way one recites a scripture worn smooth by repetition, and Eliza had nodded, and had not asked, because a woman in her position did not ask. To the household, she was a serviceable young woman of no particular account, a governess with clean hands, and a plain gray gown, and no family to speak of. That was the sum of her as far as the servants' hall was concerned, and she had let it stand, because the alternative was to explain how a gentleman's daughter had come to be teaching another gentleman's child for £30 a year and her board. There was a thing Eliza had done, in her first week, that she had told no one of. A scullery maid of perhaps 14, a thin, frightened girl called Sarah, had broken a serving dish and been threatened with the loss of her place and the whole of a quarter's wages against the cost of it, and Eliza had gone quietly to Mrs. Ben Dean and offered to pay the sum herself out of her own £30, sooner than see a child turned out onto the winter road for a cracked plate. Mrs. Dean had looked at her a long moment and said only that it would not be necessary, and had let the matter drop, and the girl had kept her place. Eliza had not done it to be seen doing it. So, she had done it because she knew better than she cared to say exactly how thin the ice was, under a girl with no family and no fortune, and how little it took to send her through. It was the only sort of courage she had, the quiet kind that costs a quarter's wages and asks for no witness. She did not know that Mrs. Dean had marked it and remembered it, and would speak of it much later to the one person whose knowing would matter. The child was named Beatrice, and she was 7 years old, and she did not speak. Not, would not. Could not, it seemed, or would not try, which, in a child of 7, amounts to nearly the same thing. She had a great quantity of dark hair, and a way of looking at a person that was older than her years, and on Eliza's first afternoon, she had put a single cold hand into Eliza's, and led her to the window and pointed without a sound at the sealed wing across the courtyard, and then looked up into Eliza's face. Eliza had said, gently, that they would look at the map of England instead. Beatrice had let go of her hand. The master of the house was the Earl of Ravensmoor, and his name was Julian Hart, and for the first 3 weeks, Eliza saw him only as a shape at the far end of a corridor, or a rider coming in wet from the moor at dusk, or a single lit window burning late in the wing she was not to enter. He did not dine with the household. He did not come to the schoolroom. Once passing on the stair, he had stopped, and looked at her and said nothing at all, and gone on. His face in that half-second had been still as stone over deep water, and she had thought, walking away, that she had never seen a man hold himself so hard against something. The season pressed even here at the edge of the world. In October, a carriage came up the long drive bearing the Dowager Countess, the Earl's mother, and with her a young lady in ice blue named Miss Frances Coldwell, whose family owned the next valley, and whose smile arranged itself the moment a titled man entered a room. The Dowager took one look at Eliza in the hall, and turned to Mrs. Dean, and said in a voice pitched exactly loud enough to carry, that she had not realized her son had taken to hiring plain little nobodies to mind the girl. A governess and nothing more, she said. One hopes she, at least, keeps the child quiet. Eliza curtsied and said nothing, and felt the words land where such words are meant to land. The words were not what kept her awake, though. What kept her awake was the wing. In her second week she had found, folded into the back of a schoolroom primer, a page of a child's drawing in a hand that was not Beatrice's. A woman at a pianoforte, sketched in soft pencil, her hair loose, her head bent to the keys. And beneath it, in the round, careful letters, a child learns first, a single word. Mama. Beatrice, when Eliza showed it to her, had gone very white, and taken the paper and pressed it flat to her chest and would not give it back, and had pointed again, with her whole small arm, at the sealed wing. No one at Ravensmoor spoke of the late Countess. Eliza gathered from a word here and a silence there that she had died some 3 years past, and that the manner of it was not discussed, and that the north wing had been shut on the day of the funeral and had not been opened since. A pianoforte still stood in it. One of the housemaids told her once, and then looked frightened at her own daring and hurried away a pianoforte, and the Earl's late wife's rooms, exactly as she had left them, a child who could not speak. A room full of a dead woman's things. A door no one might open. Eliza was a governess and nothing more, but she had been a girl who lost her own mother young, and she knew the particular silence of a child who has been asked to be quiet about grief. She recognized it the way one recognizes weather. And she began, quietly, to think about the wing. She told herself it was for Beatrice. Perhaps that was even true. The Earl came to the schoolroom for the first time on a wet afternoon in the 3rd week of October. Eliza did not hear him enter. She was on the floor with Beatrice, both of them bent over a slate, and she was drawing a treble clef and naming the notes aloud. Do, re, mi. When she felt the room change, and looked up, and he was standing in the doorway with the reins still on his shoulders, he was looking at the slate, at the small staff of music she had drawn there. "Where did you learn that?" he said, not loud, level and low, the words set down one at a time. Eliza rose. She smoothed her gray gown with hands that were steadier than she felt. "My mother taught me, my lord. Before she died, I thought Beatrice might like the shapes of it, even if she could not hear it sung to her." She did not finish the thought aloud. He looked at Beatrice then, and something moved in his stone face. Some pressure held down hard, and Eliza watched him master it. "She is not to be troubled with music," he said. "That will be all." For a moment, Eliza could not move. She looked down at the little staff of music, chalked on the slate, at the treble clef she had drawn without thinking, the shape her mother had drawn for her on a slate exactly like this one 20 years gone, in a small, warm parlor that no longer existed, and she felt the old grief turn over in her chest like a sleeper disturbed. She rubbed the clef away with the side of her hand. Before Beatrice could see her face, her fingers left a smear of chalk dust on her gray sleeve. She thought of the way the Earl had said the shapes of it as though the words themselves had a weight he could barely lift, and she understood that she had touched blind some wound she had no map of, and that the wound had music in it. He was gone before she could answer. At the door, though, he had paused, one hand flat against the frame, his back to her, for exactly the length of a held breath. And Beatrice had risen from the floor, and gone to the window and put her palm flat on the cold glass, facing the sealed wing. And Eliza had understood that whatever had shut that door had shut this child's voice inside it. That night the window in the north wing burned late, and Eliza stood at her own casement in the dark and watched it, and did not sleep. 2 more weeks went by. The dowager settled in as though she meant to stay through Christmas, and Miss Coldwell with her, and the two of them ran the drawing-room like a small court. Eliza took her meals apart, and taught her lessons, and watched the Earl come and go like weather across the moor. And twice more she came upon him in a corridor, and twice more he stopped, and looked at her a beat too long, and said something short, and left. "Come away from that window," he said to her once, finding her at the gallery. "Casement at dusk. The rain hard against it. You will take a chill." It was a command. She heard the command. She did not yet hear the thing underneath it, the thing that made him cross a cold gallery to say it at all. She heard the dowager, though. In the 2nd week of November, the old woman found her on the back stair and stopped her with the point of a folded fan. "You have been at that window again," she said, "looking at what does not concern you. I have watched you do it. Let me tell you what you are, since no one else will trouble to. You are a governess, not a friend to this family, not a confidant, certainly not anything my son requires. A governess and nothing more, and you will do very well to remember it." The fan tapped once against Eliza's arm, precise as a magistrate's gavel, and the dowager swept on. Eliza stood on the stair a long moment. Below her, through the banister, she could see into the hall, where Beatrice sat alone on the bottom step with the pencil drawing of the woman at the pianoforte held open on her knees, tracing the word beneath it with one small finger over and over. "Mama! Mama!" Something in Eliza settled then into a hard, clear resolve, not defiance, something quieter and harder to move than defiance. She began to plan the wing. She learned the servants' hours the way she had once learned her catechism. She learned that the north stair was watched by a single footman until 11, and that after 11 the man went to his supper, and the passage stood empty for the better part of an hour. She learned that the key to the wing hung on Mrs. Beck's, Dean's ring, and that Mrs. Dean hung the ring each night on a nail inside the still-room door, and that the still-room was not locked. And she learned, walking the wet yard one gray morning, that a groom's coat and a groom's hat and a groom's long, careless stride will carry a body across the servants' side of a great house entirely unremarked, because no one at Ravensmoor ever truly looked at the grooms. She did not decide it all at once. It came to her in pieces across a week of watching, the way a plan comes to a careful mind, each piece tested against the next. She counted the footman's rounds from her own dark window. She learned the particular groan the still-room door made, and how to lift it by the latch, so that it made none. She practiced, alone in the schoolroom after Beatrice slept, the long, loose stride of a groom who has nowhere he must hurry to, and no one who will stop him, and found that her own stride, quick and neat and female, gave her away in an instant, and that she must unlearn it. She was frightened, and she went on anyway, and the going on frightened her more than the fear did, because it told her something about the size of the thing that had settled in her, that she would put on another man's coat and steal a key and walk into a forbidden room for the sake of a child not her own. She told herself once more that it was for Beatrice. She was no longer entirely certain it was the whole truth. Somewhere in that week of watching the burning window across the courtyard had stopped being a mystery she wished to solve and become a man she could not stop thinking of. And that was a thing she had no business feeling and less business acting on, and she folded it down small and did not look at it. She took the coat from a peg in the harness room where a dozen of them hung, and she was certain it would not be missed for an hour. She told herself she would return it before dawn. She told herself again that it was for Beatrice. And so, on a rain-loud night in the 3rd week of November, at 11 o'clock, Eliza Marsh crossed the servants' passage in a stable boy's coat with a stolen key in her fist, and no one looked at her twice. And she came to the sealed door of the north wing and fitted the key and felt the old lock give, and stepped inside a darkness that smelled of dust and cold ashes, and very faintly of a woman's rosewater 3 years gone. The cold in the wing was of a different kind than the cold of the rest of the house. It was a still, cold, undisturbed, The cold of a room where no fire had been laid and no window opened for 3 years, and it held the faint sweetness of the rosewater beneath its dust the way deep water holds the light at the top of it. Her breath smoked in the dark. Under her borrowed coat, her heart went hard and quick against her ribs, and she stood with her back to the closed door and made herself breathe slowly until the pounding eased. She thought of Beatrice 2 floors below, asleep with the drawing under her pillow. She thought of what she was, a governess and nothing more, standing where the whole household had sworn no one would stand. And then she made herself go on, because she had not come this far in a stable boy's coat to lose her nerve at the threshold. She did not light the candle at once. She stood in the black and let her eyes learn the shapes. A long gallery. Furniture under sheets, pale and shrouded as a field of small ghosts. And at the far end, uncovered, catching the last gray light from an uncurtained window, the pianoforte. She went to it the way one goes to a thing one has come a long way to see. The lid was up. On the stand, open, stood a page of music in a woman's hand, the ink gone brown, the final bars unfinished, the last phrase breaking off mid-measure, as though the player had risen for a moment and meant to return. Eliza set her unlit candle on the closed end of the lid. She looked at the yellowed keys a long time. And then, because she was who she was, and because a child 2 floors below had pressed a drawing of this very instrument to her chest, and could not say the word that went beneath it, she sat down on the cold bench, and she laid her fingers on the keys, and softly, so softly, she began to play the unfinished phrase into its ending. She did not hear the door. She heard, when the last note had died, a voice behind her in the dark. "Take your hands off it." She stood so fast, the bench scraped. The Earl of Ravensmore stood 3 steps inside the door with a lamp in his hand, and the lamp shook, and his face in its light was not stone at all. Now it was open, and terrible, and grieving, and it was fixed on the coat she wore. "Who is that?" he began, and then the lamp lifted, and the light found her face inside the groom's collar, and he stopped as though he had walked into a wall. "You," he said. "Miss Marsh, in God's name, in his coat, in here." "My lord!" "I can explain," she said. "You cannot," he said, and his voice cracked down the middle of the word, and Eliza understood that she had done something far worse than trespass, that she had walked in a dead woman's wing wearing a disguise and sat at a dead woman's instrument and played the phrase her hand had left unfinished, and that the man before her had heard, from the corridor, that unfinished phrase completed in the dark by a woman he could not see, and had for one impossible moment believed. Something no living hand could give him. "I am sorry," Eliza whispered. "I am so sorry. I did not think. I only meant to help." "You meant to see what was behind the door," he said. The lamp lowered. Some of the terror went out of his face and left only the grief which was worse. "Everyone means to see what is behind the door." He set the lamp down on a sheeted table. He did not look at her. He looked at the pianoforte, at the brown ink on the stand. "My wife sat there," he said. 3 years ago this month she was playing that. She rose to fetch a shawl because the room had grown cold, and she went down in the passage between here and her dressing room, and by the time they reached her, she was gone, a weakness of the heart no one had known she carried. She was 29 years old, and she left a phrase unfinished on the stand and a child in the nursery who has not spoken since the day of the funeral. The rain filled the silence. Eliza stood in the borrowed coat, with her hands empty. At her sides. "I sealed it," he said, "because I could not enter it, and I could not bear that anyone else should. Every note in this house was hers. I forbade music, because I could not survive hearing it played by a living hand and knowing it was not hers. And tonight I stood in that corridor and heard her music finished. Finished. After 3 years, and for the length of a staircase, I let myself believe she had come back to it." He stopped. His jaw worked. "You are cruel," he said, without heat, which was the cruelest thing he could have said. "You did not mean to be, and yet you are." He turned to go. She has a drawing, Eliza said. He stopped. Beatrice, of a woman at a pianoforte, with the word Mama beneath it. In her own hand, she carries it against her chest. She points at this wing every day of her life, my lord, and no one will open the door for her. And so she has stopped asking with the only voice she has left, which is her hand and her eyes, because the grown people who might answer her have all decided that the kindest thing is silence. Eliza's voice was shaking now, and she let it. I did not come here for myself. I came because a child who cannot speak has been trying for 3 years to be let in to say goodbye, and I could not bear it any longer. That is the whole of my cruelty. You may dismiss me for it in the morning. You asked what I meant, and that is what I meant. For a long moment he did not move. The lamp guttered between them. And then Julian Hart, Earl of Ravensmore, who had not entered this room in 3 years, walked slowly to the pianoforte, and laid his own hand flat upon the closed lid beside her small candle, and bowed his head, and Eliza saw his shoulders move once, hard, the way a man's shoulders move when something long held finally breaks. Go to bed, Miss Marsh, he said at last. His voice was wrecked and quiet. Leave the coat. Leave the key. Go to bed. She went. At the door she looked back, and he had sat down on the bench where his wife had died, mid-phrase, and he had laid his fingers on the keys. And he did not play, only rested them there in the dark as if learning the cold of them. She did not sleep. Near dawn she heard, very faint, 3 notes from across the courtyard, struck once and let ring. Then silence. Then the 3 notes again. A man alone in the dark, teaching his own hand to bear the sound of the thing he had forbidden. In the morning she expected her dismissal. It did not come. What came instead, at the schoolroom door after breakfast, was the Earl himself, changed in some way she could not name, the stone gone porous. He stood in the doorway and looked at Beatrice, who had frozen over her slate at the sight of him, and then he crossed the room and knelt down on the floor in front of his daughter, which Eliza would have wagered her year's wages. He had not done since the funeral, and he said, very low, I hear you have a drawing. Of your mother, at her instrument. Beatrice stared at him. I should like to see it, he said. And then, if you will permit me, I should like to show you the room where she played it, you and I together. The door is open now. Beatrice looked at him for a long, long moment, and then she reached into her pinafore and drew out the folded drawing, and put it into her father's hand, and she made a sound, not a word. A single cracked syllable, rusted from 3 years of disuse, and yet it was aimed at him, and it was meant for him, and Eliza had to turn to the window so that neither of them should see her face. That afternoon the 3 of them went into the north wing, together in the gray daylight, and the Earl drew the sheets off the furniture one by one, and Beatrice walked among the uncovered chairs, touching each of them as though greeting a room full of the people they had once held. And she stood a long time at the pianoforte with her small hand on the brown-inked page, and Eliza stood back by the door and let them have it, the 2 of them, in the room where their whole grief had lived alone for 3 years. Once, Beatrice tugged at her father's sleeve and pointed at the unfinished page on the stand, and looked up at him with a question her face could make, though her voice could not yet, and the Earl bent and studied the brown ink a long moment and said, Your mother wrote this. She never finished it. She meant to. And Beatrice had reached out one finger and touched the last written note, and then the empty staff after it, the silence where the rest of the music should have gone, and had looked from the page to Eliza and back with an expression Eliza would not forget, because it was the look of a child understanding, for the first time, that a thing left unfinished is not the same as a thing that never was. The dowager was not pleased. She found the open wing that evening, and her face when she came into the drawing-room was white with a fury she pitched, as always, just under the threshold of open accusation. She did not know yet the whole of it, but she knew a governess had been at the center of it, and she said so. To her son, in front of Miss Coldwell and Mrs. Dean, and 2 visiting neighbors, her voice climbing to fill the room. "You have let a hired nobody into your late wife's private rooms," she said. "A servant, a little gray governess with ideas above her place. Do you understand what will be said of this house? A governess and nothing more, meddling in a grief that is not hers to touch. She has imposed on your low spirits, and you cannot see it. I will not have it, Julian. Send her back to whatever parish she came from, and be done." Eliza was not in the room. Mrs. Dean told her the whole of it. After, though, because Mrs. Dean's own eyes had changed since the morning she had seen the child put a sound to her father's face. The Earl, Mrs. Dean said, had waited until his mother finished, and then he had stood in front of all of them, and he had said only this: "She gave my daughter her voice, 5 words. He had let them stand in the silence they made. And into that silence Beatrice, who had been sitting unnoticed on the window seat with her drawing, had climbed down and crossed the whole length of the bright room, past the dowager, past the pale, rigid figure of Miss Coldwell, and had gone to Eliza's empty chair, and stood beside it with her hand on its back, claiming the place of a woman who was not even there. And no one in that room, Mrs. Dean said, had been able to say a single word against it, because a child who had not spoken in 3 years had just told them all, without a syllable, exactly whose side she was on. The dowager left within the week. She took Miss Coldwell with her, and her diamonds, and her certainty, and the last thing she said to Eliza, cornered by the waiting carriage, was quieter than all her public cruelties, and therefore closer to the truth. "You have arranged this very cleverly," she said. "A motherless child, a grieving man. I know the shape of a campaign when I see one." And Eliza, who had arranged nothing, who had wanted only to open a door for a silent child, looked the old woman full in the face and said, "I have arranged nothing, my lady. I only refused to pretend the door was a wall." The dowager had no answer for that. She got into her carriage. She did not look back, but she went, and the house exhaled behind her. What followed was slow and quiet, and had no witnesses but the moor. The Earl began to dine with the household. He began to come to the schoolroom in the afternoons and sit at the back, while Beatrice, who had a word, now and then 2, and then a careful growing handful, named the notes on the slate aloud in her small returning voice. He was not a man made suddenly warm. He was a man whose stone had learned, slowly, to hold water again. And yet Eliza came to know the particular quiet of him, and to know that when he stood too long at the schoolroom window at dusk, it was not the moor he was looking at, and when he said, in his level way, that she ought to come in from the cold gallery, or that she had worked too late and must eat something, the command was the only shape his tenderness knew how to take, and that underneath every order was the same held, careful, disbelieving want. There was an afternoon that stayed with her. Beatrice had fallen asleep over her copybook, worn out with the effort of her returning words, and Eliza had carried her to the nursery cot and come back to find the Earl in the schoolroom doorway, watching her come. He did not speak at once. He had a book in his hand, one of the child's primers, and he turned it over as though he had forgotten why he held it. "She said my name this morning," he said finally. "At breakfast, Julian." "Not Papa." "Julian," the way her mother used to say it when I had done something to vex her. His voice did not break, but it came near it, and Eliza watched the effort of holding it whole cost him something across the jaw. "I had forgotten," he said, "that I once minded being vexed, that there was a person alive who could vex me." He looked at Eliza then directly, the way he had looked at her on the stair that first week, and this time she understood the look, and it warmed her to the wrists. "Thank you," he said, level and low, and left before she could answer. Which she was beginning to understand was simply his way to say the unbearable thing and remove himself from the room before it could be answered, as though an answer might undo him. She knew, too, what her own body knew before she permitted her mind to know it, that she was aware, always, of exactly where he stood in a room. That when he leaned across her once at the schoolroom table to correct a line of Beatrice's copybook, the warmth of him at her shoulder made her forget the word she had been about to say. that she had begun to listen near dawn for the 3 notes across the courtyard, and that they came more often now, and lasted longer, and had begun, some mornings, to become almost a melody. It came to its point on a still evening in December, the first snow feathering down past the gallery windows. He found her there, where he had so often found her, and this time he did not tell her to come away from the glass. He came and stood beside her and watched the snow with her, close enough that she could feel the cold he had brought in from outside, and for a long while neither of them spoke. "I have been trying to say a thing," he said at last, "and I find I do not have the manner for it. I have been 3 years out of the habit of wanting anything." He turned to her. In the snow light his face was wholly unguarded, and it cost him visibly to keep it so. "I want you to stay," he said, "not as her governess. I am asking as a man asks. Eliza and I have not asked anyone anything in a very long time, and I am asking badly, and I would ask you to forgive that, and answer me anyway." It was the first time he had used her given name. It fell into the quiet like the first note of the phrase she had finished in the dark. Her hand had risen without her leave and stopped an inch from his sleeve. She made herself hold it there, in the space between reaching and arriving, because she knew that once she closed it, there would be no unmaking of what came after. And she wanted, for one held breath, to stand at the very edge of it and know it was hers. "I came into your house wearing another man's coat," she said, and her voice was not steady. "I have nothing, no fortune, no family to speak of. Your mother is right about the whole of what I am." "My mother," he said, "does not know the first thing about what you are." He lifted his own hand and closed the last inch of distance her fingers had left, and turned her hand in his and held it. "I heard my dead wife's music, finished in the dark," he said, "and I was angry, because for the length of a staircase it broke my heart open. And then I came through that door and found it was you, and I have spent every day since learning that the breaking open was the mercy. You did not give me back what I lost. You gave me back the part of myself that could bear to lose it." His thumb moved once across her knuckles. "Stay," he said. "Please." Eliza closed her hand. She did not say yes with words. She turned her face up to his and let the snow light show him her answer, and he bent, slowly, giving her every moment to draw back, and did not, and kissed her once, soft and full and unhurried, a thing that could not now be unmade, and that neither of them wished to unmake. When they drew apart she was smiling, and so astonishingly was he the first true smile she had seen on that grave face, and it undid her more than the kiss had. They were married in the small stone church at the foot of the drive in the last week of January, with the moor white to the horizon, and the whole household in the pews, and Beatrice standing up beside Eliza in a new green pelisse, holding the ring on a ribbon and giving it over, when the moment came, in a clear whole sentence, spoken aloud in a full church. The longest string of words she had yet put together, and not one soul present, who had known the silence of that house, could hear it without weeping. Mrs. Dean wept openly in the second pew, and did not trouble to hide it, and afterward pressed Eliza's hand at the church door and said, "I saw what you did for the scullery girl in your first week, Miss Marsh. I never said. I say it now. This house has wanted a woman in it who would spend her own coin on a stranger's trouble, and it has one at last." And Eliza, who had thought that small, quiet act long forgotten, understood that nothing done kindly is ever quite as unwitnessed as it seems. There was no grand ball. That was not the shape of them. There was instead a small warm evening some weeks later. Snow again at the windows, the fires lit. The north wing open now, and aired and full of light, its sheets long gone. The furniture that had stood shrouded for 3 years stood bare, and polished now, catching the firelight, and a servant came in each morning to open the shutters and let the gray moorlight fall across a floor that had known only dark. The rose water was gone from the air. In its place, there was wood smoke and beeswax, and the ordinary living smell of a room used daily by people who loved one another. The pianoforte had been tuned. A man had come out from the town to do it, and had remarked not knowing whose it was or what it had held. That it was a fine old instrument, and a pity to have let it stand so long unplayed. And the Earl had answered only that yes, it had been a pity, and that it would not stand unplayed again. And in the room where a phrase had waited 3 years to be finished, Eliza sat at the pianoforte, with Beatrice pressed warm against her side. And the Earl stood behind them with one hand resting on his wife's shoulder, and Beatrice's small finger found the last line of her mother's music on the stand and traced the final unfinished bar. "Play it," the child said. 2 words, whole and clear. And Eliza laid her hands on the keys in the light this time, with both of them beside her, and finished the phrase again, and let it ring out warm and living into the room that had held it. And the last note did not die into silence as it had that first cold night. It died into the ordinary sound of a fire and a child's breathing and a man saying his wife's name low, and the snow going on falling, unhurried over a house where the doors were open now, and would stay so. If Eliza's journey moved you, stay a moment at the end and let it settle. Some doors are only walls, because no one has been brave enough to try the key.